Hello, and welcome, once again, to Frankly. Today I'm here to talk to you about Clown World War. Why are you here? Why am I here? And why is Walter there?
Hey guys, I'm sorry there's no joke for this week. I'm just here in my home. I didn't really have time to do anything funny, so I hope just my presence is enough, and I guess that you get something out of this. I do have to go. I have a lot of quests, and I feel like my brain's made of carpet. I guess peace and love. See you next week.
Clown World War is the affectionate term that we apply to the total project of replacing our civilization with a series of increasingly insane policies. The term Clown World came around about 10 years ago when the assault on sanity, reality, and our Christian civilization intensified in what became known in certain circles as World War T. World War T, or World War Trans, was only one dimension of Clown World. Why war? Because, as I will explain here today, the techniques of mass society using mass communication, marketing, the manipulation of unconscious desires, all combined in a technique whose overall goal appears to be identical with the controlled demolition of our entire civilization and its Christian foundations. This, I argue, is a form of next generational warfare, and I think it is fitting to begin this presentation with a respectful honk. With that out of the way, let's move to discuss some of the movements, or if you like, fashionable crazes that typified the intensification of Clown World into a full-scale assault on the basis of reality. In brief today, I will talk to you about a few of the campaigns of Clown World War, including the creation of a modern secular idol in a sort of virally transmitted craze, the beatification of St. George Floyd, of course, and World War T itself, which, as I will explain, came about through a suspiciously successful process of social media and online manipulation to emerge as the victor in the self-harm and peak victimhood Olympics of the earlier internet. As we all know, I, Frank Wright, have really put the micro into micro-celebrity. Anyone who achieves any modicum of fame upon the internet, however minuscule they or their fame may be, must immediately proceed to the highest purpose of appearing on screen. The grift.
Do you want to be a CEO like me? Do you want to shout into telephones, cavort with ponies, and make bank? You too can live the executive dream and secure a premier lifestyle just like mine.
Oi! Get away from my car!
Ah, get yourself a neck clock. No house, no clothes, no problem. With a neck clock, you are instantly dressed like a boss. Get your neck clock today. With a neck clock, it's me time all the time.
Terms and conditions apply. Neck clock costs only $1 per second for life. Your children may inherit the credit agreement.
I have warned you before about the dangers of thinking. As you can see, the predicament I now inhabit is a result of my unhealthy addiction to having thoughts. Furthermore, the dubious habit of reading books has also delivered me into what I would laughingly call my career and the current predicament you witnessed before you today. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of ideas that came out of some books written by some influential people in the mid-20th century, which also explain how our world has been driven mad, not just by intentionally crazed, virally transmitted current things, but also by processes that arise from the technological and mass society we inhabit. Today, we're going to explore how the lunatics made an asylum of our entire way of life and sought to make a casualty of anyone who is in it. Today we will see how Clown World War encouraged individuals desperate for meaning and significance in their lives to unilaterally declare war on their own civilization, on everything normal. This outbreak of mass-scale normophobia was no accident. In the previous videos, such as disintegration, detransition, and desublimation, I've explained some of the techniques by which the peculiar experiment called liberal democracy sought to replace our entire Christian civilization with itself. Using new technologies in mass communication, new ideas from people like Sigmund Freud, his nephew Edward Bernays, the godfather of modern propaganda, and Wilhelm Reich, who redefined fascism as anyone who has a family, anyone who is normal, and of course anyone who believes in God, family, country. These techniques inform what I'm about to tell you today. But in addition to that, the scale of mass society and its constitution itself in its increasing urbanization, and its demoralization in the literal sense, in which it subtracts the meaning of your life and replaces it with nothing at all, are also powerful, influential processes that have produced the madhouse that we see around us today. Finally, before I get into it, I would remind you that there is a remedy for all this. I've mentioned before that the Catholic social teaching, which I write about frequently on my Substack every Monday, instructs you in how to think, how to behave, how to organise the economy and the state. In short, the Catholic Church in its traditional magisterium is a luminous guide not only to the salvation of your soul, but also a practical guide to human flourishing at every level of life. I recommend you heartily to read about it, and this is why I'm writing a series about it right now. Each one of the 9 encyclicals of the Catholic social teaching explains where we went wrong and how we can replace this compulsory or mandatory madness with the sanity inspired by the divinely created natural order of God himself. Moving swiftly on from God, his message, the nature of reality, and the condition of humanity naturally ordained, let's now plunge into the campaign known as Clown World War. I've explained before that it's my belief.
Hey, it's me again. Anytime Frank put on the red nose or took it off, it made the autofocus on his camera not be able to detect a face there. So sometimes he's just gonna be blurry. Oops.
This guy stinks!
The liberal democratic experiment was just basically a well-marketed project to replace your entire civilization with itself. Consider, if you will, that there was a tribe, and that this tribe had customs that went back 1400 years to the beginnings of its civilization. Imagine again that this tribe is yours, and the customs that it had were those of Christianity. Now, what we can see in Clown World War, from this point of view, is after a century of the replacement ideology, in practice, in policy, in business and in public life, what we can see is that once you remove these tribal customs, you have to replace them with others. Customs of belief, belief about reality, belief about morality, belief about what is true and what is good. And it's that enormous void that results from the subtraction of the profound meaning of the divine order that we shall see powered the descent into the satanic jamboree that we know as the new normal today. Liberal democracy's ambitions to replace everything with itself is the reason why you need new norms, new values, new ideas about everything. As Edward Bernays knows very well, if you call something new, you can sell it much easier. But this is not the only reason why people go for these current thing crazes. So, in terms of the campaigns waged in Clown World War, let's now turn to the phenomenon ironically dubbed as the current thing. Current thing is a mimetic response to the viral madness, or if you like, mass formation psychosis that's periodically transmitted through the media, broadcast media, digital media, into people's brains to mobilise them in some insane cause or another. It's been variously lampooned by a series of rather interesting memes that display people who believe in these things as NPCs. This means non-playable character. It means that they are as soulless and directionless in themselves as a programmed character in a video game that's controlled by a pre-programmed set of rules. Basically, what's happened in the last 10 years is an intensification of the technique of mass manipulation and its refinement from a personal to a state level. Let's go back to the beginnings, if you like, of the transgender phenomenon. Aside from the fact that it's obviously backed by very powerful industrial and financial interests, such as those of J.B. Pritzker, their family, and also Martin Rothblatt, who likes to call himself a woman, aside from the fact that it is an industry, and it is heavily monetized, and it tends to sponsor all the favourable things that it wishes to see in academic and medical research and so on. Aside from this, how was it spread into the minds of children? How did you end up with a Tavistock Clinic report that said inquiries about gender reassignment and confusion had multiplied by 400%? I think if we go back to the 1990s, we can explain how mass culture informs and indeed infuses these current thing crazes with their tremendous power. The 1990s in popular culture saw a movement, if you like, towards the idea that being mentally ill was cool. Radiohead became the biggest band in the world, promoting a sort of fashionable miserableism that was identified as being sophisticated and also having a wry detachment from the attractions of consumer society. If you were ironically detached, you could signal that you were superior to this. But being a bit like Roland Barthes wasn't enough. You didn't just detach your signifier, you also had to be miserable, because that made you the coolest of them all. Now, if we move on from this, you can see that we also then received the globalized and rather cringe-inducing product that is emo. Wherewith young men in makeup would cry into microphones about how tortured they were inside. This, of course, became phenomenally successful. And why not? Because, of course, there's nothing wrong with young men wearing makeup to make money out of immiserating your children. Nothing wrong at all with that, of course. From a pig in a cage on antibiotics of Radiohead to crawling in my skin, I think of My Chemical Romance. You can see how this new lifestyle became, if you like, mass marketed to vulnerable teenagers and pre-teens. Now, at the same time, the early internet was growing up and becoming much more popular with the kids. Things like MySpace, LiveJournal, and the eternally toxic and damnable Tumblr. These had a particular niche impact on the youngest users of the internet. And it's in Tumblr and also in LiveJournal where you can mark the beginnings of World War T's campaign to dominate the minds of the young. In fact, members of the trans cult have admitted that it's spread by what they call social contagion. And that means getting people to believe that it's a good thing to believe in by exposing them to it a lot. If you haven't learned this lesson yet, people are apt to believe anything if you tell them it often enough. You just have to keep repeating the message. People are apt to believe anything if you tell them it often enough. You just have to keep repeating the message. Our differently sane friends, the Tranningtons, know this very well, and so they saturated social media with pro-trans posts to this day. However, how did this begin? After the miserablest cult of the 1990s began to bleed into the earlier adoption of the internet by younger people, you saw them, if you like, compete in a sort of obscene or a sort of depression Olympics, wherewith the more mentally ill you were, the more anxiety you suffered, the more maladjusted and disordered your mind, the cooler you were. There grew up a kind of subculture of self-harm and self-deprecation in that sense, which conferred a queer sort of status with the emphasis on queer. Young people began to cut themselves with razors and display pictures of their own self-harm. So you could see that there was already a current on LiveJournal with young people novelising and diarising their own mental disorder, and that there was some kind of imperative behind this, because the worse it was, the cooler they were, and the more status they got within this distorted little subculture. So after sharing pictures of cutting themselves, the self-harm intensified. The idea that you had to be mentally ill meant it progressed. Now remember that if you're a progressive, you believe that things have to always progress. From a detached point of view, you can say that things have to become more extreme every year, and the self-harm Olympics was no different. It progressed. How did it progress? Enter the Trannington. The Trannington is the supreme victim. That was their object, that's the status they claim. Peak victimhood, as even the feminists recognise it. The Trannington says that they are persecuted, that if you criticise their insane and perverted beliefs, their exhibitionism and so on, then you're committing genocide. But the Trannington combines the most devastating aspects of self-harm. It combines, obviously, a serious delusion upon which you base your entire personality. It's a profound mental illness. It also adds surgical mutilation. And then it puts hormone disruptors into the mix. And whatever the hormone disruptors are, we all know, whether it's the contraceptive pill, whether it's steroids you take down the gym, whether it's antidepressants, or whether it's puberty blockers, as they like to call them, these profoundly disturb your mind and in fact change your personality, and some say they alter it permanently and seldom for the good. This, of course, confers the crown of peak victimhood on the Tranningtons. And I think if you look at the early adoption of the internet, from the late 90s up to the mid-2000s, 2005, 6 to 9, 10, you can see how it spread epidemically amongst disaffected teenagers. Teenagers who wanted a new way of looking cool. A subcultural meme, if you like, grew up of peak victimhood. And I think this explains some of the phenomenal attractive power of World War T and why its campaign was so successful in recruiting so many people into its diabolical ranks. And it is diabolical. It's expressly opposed to the natural order of God, seeks to destroy the basis of biological reality. Some of its slogans actually do say they want to disfigure the creation of God. And of course, Martin Rothblatt has invented a trans religion in which he does away with God entirely, replacing it, of course, with technology. What technology? Well, the technology that he believes permitted to him to become a woman. Of course, he didn't. He's still a bloke, but he's a very rich one, a very powerful one, and someone who has done a great deal to transmit these memes into the minds of children that you may know. So much for World War T. Now, around 2015, 10 years ago, World War T reached what I believed was its peak influence. This may seem an odd thing to say, since the trannies are always with us. It would appear. This was the time when states, governments began to consider giving anyone the right to say they were a woman and have that legally recognised and defended. Millions of women mobilised against this in Britain and elsewhere, recognising correctly, of course, that this was a direct assault upon them and their identity, and that perhaps they didn't like very much the idea of being replaced in their own lives by men dressed as obscene, sexualised parodies of themselves. What on earth they could have to object to about that, no one knows, but then came the bursting into the changing rooms, the the self-insertion into children's story times, and also into their changing rooms as well, into their swimming lessons and so on. For some mysterious reason, our Trannington friends never want to read to the elderly. It's always little children. That is a mysterious mystery, which can never be solved, of course. But it's one which has garnered the attention of everyone who hasn't been driven mad by the increasingly insane and pathologizing processes of mass society. World War T, then, was a major campaign in Clown World War. Why was it, again, Clown World War? Because it's a direct assault upon the nature of reality. It denies God, everything that flows for him in the natural order that he created, the basis of man and woman, the innocence of children, and perhaps former moral norms that took a dim view of people's willful sexual exhibitionism as a means of gaining influence at work, in politics, and over you. Not only did they do this in public, but they demanded the right to punish anyone who dared to disagree with them. This, of course, can be seen dispassionately as an assault on the sane. This is a theme that you will see constantly through every current thing. Now, World War T is still going on. I would suggest that our differently sane friends, the Tranningtons, aren't winning that war. But if you look at all the current things, all the crazes promoted in the technological society through mass media that mobilise people in these insane causes and that stir such passionate feelings behind them in these little foot soldiers, every single one of these reduces to the category of a war on sanity. If you are sane, you are called nasty names. In this case, if you oppose this particular brand of insanity, you're a transphobe. However, if you resist the honk apocalypse in any other dimension, there's special nasty names for you as well. Of course, who could forget the preposterous nonsense regime of social distancing for a disease, I should remind you, that you had to test yourself to see if you had. This is what I mean by saying that Clown World War came to state level. As you can see, it is not only hilarious in some of its dimensions, but also extremely dark. And again, this is a war on the prudent, on the circumspect, on people who have self-restraint, on people who do not desperately need approval from other people, on people who can resist social pressures. Basically, this is a war on the wise and the sane. And it was a war to discredit everybody who had an independence of mind from the mass media narratives of the current thing. How did that end? Surely we were going to be plagued by an endless series of terrifying variants, and that's what we were told, until, of course, Vladimir Putin stopped it all by invading Ukraine. I will now don the intellectual spectacles for a brief diversion on the subject of that war. I am not excusing Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, and nor am I going to get into the reasons for that invasion, which are complex but also involve serious moves by NATO to push its borders towards Russia and therefore collapse and overextend it and absorb it into the liberal global empire, etc. In brief, that war began in a rather clownish fashion in itself, at least in 2019, but my own personal research shows that it goes back to 1952, when the United States, interestingly, started backing Ukrainian nationalists to provide a bulwark against Russian influence when it was still the Soviet Union. The beclowning of the world is so intense that very few people are interested in hearing about these facts. This does not mean to say that the Russians are right. It does not mean to say that everything you're told is wrong. It just means to say that what is left out of the official narrative is as much a part of the current thing as what is included. Now, the Ukraine war became a phenomenally divisive but overwhelmingly coordinated campaign to compel everyone in the liberal West to support Zelensky. The merits of this war aside, it is interesting to see that once again the defence of democracy is invoked in order to sell you a war. If people who have been unfortunate enough to read my Substack will know that in my notes about my book on liberal democracy, I pointed out that this phrase was first used by Woodrow Wilson in 1917 to get Americans to enter what would become World War I. The defence of democracy is itself a meme and which is invoked whenever a war becomes the current thing. Now, why would I describe Ukraine as a current thing? We saw an epidemic of people adding blue and yellow flags to their bios, condemning people who didn't support it, calling anyone who had any reservations about it a Russian propagandist, saying that they were echoing Putin's talking points, that they were a traitor for not wanting to stoke a ruinous conflict on the borders of Europe, which appears to have ended in disaster. Predictable disaster as well. Indeed, some would argue self-sabotaging, given the effect of the economic sanctions and the mysterious mystery of the exploding gas pipeline of Nord Stream, which have had catastrophic effects on German industry and by extension the entire European economy. In fact, the reason why things are so expensive now in Europe is never connected to this event, but of course if your energy prices go up phenomenally, then everything else does as well, and they stay there until you return to sanity. In this case, I would say sanity is the preference for trade over war, and the recognition that though people are unlike us, and we may not very much like them, it is better to not kill each other because of our differences, and perhaps better to learn to live with them. I'm probably going to be called a Russian propagandist for that, but there it is. The idea that we've been sold a war isn't new. Of course, in 2003, the defence of democracy was invoked for the bombing and destruction of Iraq. That was a wonderful idea, wasn't it? Look how that's delivered the region to the Iranians and fomented Islamic terrorism and promoted mass migration, and the crisis in Libya was the same, and you can see where this is going. All the wars get promoted as the defence of democracy when actually they demolish your entire way of life. And so do all the other current things. I mean, if you look again in 2020 at what became known as the BLM riots, this was the creation of a secular idol. George Floyd was a criminal who died after having been arrested for committing a crime of a drug overdose. Now, these facts were known at the toxicology report at the time, and they're being reprised now, showing that it was the fentanyl and not, I think, the half dozen other drugs in his system that actually killed him. Nevertheless, he's seen as the victim of a racist policeman who is a terrible person because he's white. Worst of all, he was trying to stop a criminal from committing crimes. The liberation of black people from the prosecution of their crimes saw them kill each other in record numbers after this event. Of course, defunding the police is an insane idea, but it became a current thing, a thing so current and so powerful that you saw your politicians, your sportsmen, your celebrities all kneeling, genuflecting in the cause of St. George Floyd. Now, it's interesting that this doesn't get much of an airing anywhere. As you might realise, a lot of these current things, they become so cringe-inducing, so ridiculous after the moment, that no one can bear to even remember them. The BLM sensation that was phenomenally successful in mobilising world leaders and your favourite celebrities in kneeling for, a man who is, in kneeling for St. Floyd. The BLM situation descended into an almost bottomless sense of ignominy. Just one scandal after another about embezzlement and the misappropriation of funds and so on. It became simply, quite obviously, a scam. And we all got scammed by that if you walked along with it. If you dared not to, you had to keep quiet because you would be called terrible names. You'd be called a racist. You'd say that you supported murder. You were a terrible person. Of course, you always are when the current thing comes rolling around. When this form of mimetic warfare is mobilised by the state, then you can expect to be hated for remaining sane. Everything sane is a form of extremism these days. And in case you haven't noticed, noticing the obvious out loud is deeply controversial. These things are obvious, but to say them out loud is not only shocking, you can risk your career, your livelihood, and even your life. So be careful. If you're going to notice, do so in silence. Now then, how does all this happen? Obviously, these things get transmitted through the mass media. Obviously, they appeal to people who have no sense of meaning in their lives, or rather, the less sense of meaning you have, the less secure you are in yourself, if you like. The more of a hole there is in the centre of you, the more it desperately needs to be filled. And furthermore, some people have argued that the way we live in high concentrations in a mass-scale society is itself driving us into pathological behaviours as it does mice and rats. So now I'm going to talk to you about two ideas from around the middle of the 20th century, which can help you to understand why people are so susceptible to the current thing, why they're so willing to entertain these fashionable crazes, and why the way that we live in modern urban environments may be driving us all mad before any of this even happened. There was an ethologist called J.B. Calhoun who talked about urban density and social pathology in 1962. What does that mean? What he meant was he did a series of experiments on mice and rats which showed as you increased the population, worse and worse behavioural traits emerged in them, and all the normal ones dissolved. That mass society itself, he said, could be the reason why people were going mad. How did he know this? He said there was a point at which the concentration of populations in mice and rat populations turned their utopias into a living hell. He called this the behavioural sink. Calhoun noticed in his first experiment with rats that once they got beyond a certain number, they started to act in damaging ways. All their normal behaviours were replaced with things like aggression and self-harm and the refusal to mate and the total breakdown of their normal lives, despite the fact that they lived in what he termed a kind of rat utopia. All their food needs were met, their water, they had places to exercise. It was simply the sheer number of them. Once it reached a certain number, then things began to go very bad. Calhoun then staged an experiment with mice, which became even more famous. You can read about this in O'Brien's book, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIM. The NIM is the National Institute of Mental Health, where Calhoun worked for a while, and it's a story based upon his work. When Calhoun did his experiments on mice, he noted that the concentration of their population at a certain point led to a complete social breakdown, with mice refusing to mate and therefore leading themselves towards extinction. This is what he meant by total societal collapse. It was so profound that he said that this was actually a first sort of death. He said the second death was the actual death of the organism, but the first death was the extinction while living of all normal behaviours and their replacement with behaviours that were self-harming, self-destructive, and that actually ruined the possibility of the survival of the group entirely. This, I think, has a profound lesson to teach us, as Calhoun himself believed, for what happens to humans when they're concentrated in what we now call urban bug hives. This is an amusing term, but if you consider the example of Calhoun, he believed, of course, that this did have a meaning for humans. He did say that this maybe bespeaks of a process of pathologizing humanity towards a complete societal collapse. Basically, he's saying that urban concentrations at scale naturally make everyone mentally ill to the point where they won't have children anymore, and they harm themselves and become aggressive and indulge in self-destructive behaviours. In fact, he said, it's completely denormalising. And again, he said that this was a sort of first death before the death of the body, a living death. In a very real sense, Calhoun's work shows how the attempts to create a utopia by providing supposedly ideal conditions planned in a laboratory-like way actually results in a living hell that extinguishes the belief in the meaning of life and the basis of any normal instincts whatsoever. So it's not just the actions of factions, it's not just the liberals mobilising insanity as a weapon of warfare to get you to declare a unilateral war on everything that was and everything that makes sense, and to destroy yourself in it and feel good about it for a time whilst you're waving your flags and getting on your knees and banging your pots and so on. It's not just this. Calhoun's work shows you that the nature of mass society itself may have some profoundly negative impacts on human health and upon whether or not we can find any meaning in our lives. Apart from seeing modern urban life as a cheeseless maze where the only reward is ever-intensifying discheesement, There's another concept that I wanted to tell you about. Again, I make no apologies for having read books, but I would warn you that if you continue to do so, you might turn into something resembling me. There's a Hungarian Jewish thinker came to Britain in the middle of the 20th century, and he came up with a concept called moral inversion. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting things that I encountered in ideas in recent years, and it was given to me by a Canadian Catholic and journalist. That was Kevin Michael Grace. Now, if you ever despair of watching depressing things, miserable slop on the internet or elsewhere, why don't you go and have a look at his show, the KMG show, which is on Rumble. And I think he's a tremendous fellow and has given me some remarkable insights into life that I would probably never otherwise have come across. So he's a good man and a wise man. And he told me about moral inversion, and it opened my eyes to how these processes become so popular. Okay, you've got mass society, which drives people a bit crackers anyway, or indeed very crackers. You've got mass technology, which allows for the viral transmission of these toxic ideas into the minds of tens or even hundreds of millions of people at once. And of course, you've got people conditioned, if you like, to consume what is on sale. Not just the products that they wear or they eat or that they aspire to own, but also the products, the food for thought that they consume in their minds, and the beliefs that they're desperate to have to give their lives a sense of significance. So, you have these social processes of conditioning, if you like. You have these technological processes that can be used and are used for control. But you also have the side effects, if you like, of replacing the custom of your tribe and all of its meaning and significance and all of its order with nothing. Enter Michael Polanyi and his concept of moral inversion. Now, it doesn't just mean becoming a victim in Satan's big top booming business of destroying everything of value in our lives. No, moral inversion is more than the inversion of virtue and vice, and the inversion of vice with virtue. It's more than the celebration of sin through mass consumer nihilism. Moral inversion is about the concept of the emptiness in mankind and where it comes from, and how it makes people susceptible, even desperate, for any meaning, however meaningless, to be supplied for them to attach their feelings to feel good about themselves for a while, or to feel for a moment that what they feel actually matters. Michael Polanyi said moral inversion was the condition where moral passion is detached entirely from its divinely inspired order and origins, and instead reduced to purely materialistic ideas. What that means is, moral inversion is a result of being godless. What does it do to people? Polanyi said that moral inversion not only made you invert moral values, saying that everything good was evil, if that sounds familiar, and everything evil was good, if that also sounds familiar. No, it doesn't just promote a lifestyle of sin as a virtue. What it also does is it creates what he called a homeless moral passion. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant an intense feeling, an intense urge, an emotional power, a hunger for feeling moral, for moralizing about something, anything, even if it's deeply immoral, it doesn't matter. It's detached, again, from any wider significance. So, moral inversion is the condition where godless people feel a desperate need to feel intensely moral about something, anything that might come along, like the current thing. Polanyi said that it was a mistake to try and replace these philosophical and spiritual aims with purely material practices. So what that means is that you can't replace the appetite for the divine, and you can't replace the morality that flows from Christ, from God himself, with these materialist or reductionist ideas, which he said were often used to promote some kind of utopia on earth. What he also said was that people who are subject to these homeless moral passions that power the current thing, Michael Polanyi said that they would almost inevitably resort also to violence and see it not only as justifiable and necessary, but inevitable. This is again where the aspect of war comes into Clown World, because the moral nihilists who fall for it so completely, who invest their identities in gluing themselves to motorways to change the weather, for example, in defacing masterpieces with soup and slashing them with razor blades, in calling you terrible names for having a nice big truck, in telling you that you're a traitor for not wanting to destroy your nation's economy and kill millions of people by funding perpetual war. Or that you're a racist because you don't want your country to be invaded by a ceaseless flood of new consumers supplied only for the interests of the liberal consumer elite. All these causes that you're hated for not supporting, all these current things, what they all have in common is that when you examine them in any wider context, they don't make sense anymore. They break down. It's just a symbol that's infused deliberately with an intense moral fervour. And all that's significant when the current thing is current is whether you believe in it or not, whether you signal your virtue or your vice. And again, the bad people here are those sane enough to resist this mass hysteria. Why is mass hysteria so popular? Why does this technique always work? Time and again, some current thing comes along and they're all insane and they're all destructive. They're all mad. Why do people never learn? Well, that's because they're desperate. A man who is starving will eat practically anything. When you ask why people lap this up, consume it, when you think about sneering people for consuming the government's swill or slop in this way, ask again who supplied the hunger and what the nature of that hunger is. Michael Polanyi told you that this was a pathology. It made people mentally ill, that subtracting the real divinely ordained meaning of their lives made them mentally ill and promoted moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the belief that there are no morals and that everything is naturally going to be degraded, that there is no point to life. In fact, that the condition of life is absurd because we die, and there ultimately is no reason to behave in any moral sense at all. Various figures such as existentialists, psychoanalysts, and so on, anarchists, lots of people have come together to tell you that there's no reason at all to obey any kind of moral imperative. Now, Polanyi explains why that happens. Again, it's the subtraction of the divine origin of moral behaviour that creates a void in man. So he becomes so desperate, so hungry for meaning, that he'll believe in anything, even if just for a while, and even if only to stop feeling bad about himself for a short time. I would offer the revolutionary point of view that if you are a bad person, or in fact do bad things, perhaps it is not entirely inappropriate to feel a little bad about yourself from time to time. Maybe you ought to look to correcting those bad behaviours rather than investing your entire identity into some mimetic craze that results in further destruction. One further dimension of Michael Polanyi for anyone who's interested is he said that value-neutral liberty was a complete fiction. What does that mean? It means that the liberal idea generally tells you that freedom is good, liberty is good, being liberated is good. If you look at what all these current things have liberated people into committing crime, in carrying on, in fact complying, banging pots, cheering on a regime that transferred an enormous amount of wealth, historically the greatest amount of wealth from working and middle class people, up to the elites. These are the things that you're supposed to cheer on. If you cheer these things on, then what you're doing is that you are believing that you're being liberated by these things, that it's liberating in a sense, that really you're for progress, you're for science, you're against racism when you celebrate St. George Floyd and his apotheosis. You're for liberation when you celebrate permanent war. None of these things hold up, of course, but what they really do is they mobilise again that liberationist idea of liberalism that tells you that the ideal for mankind is to free himself or herself from not only all moral restraints, but from all the natural limitations of biology and reality as well. This is not just a war on your civilization. Clown World War is a total war. And why is it a total war? Wollt ihr den totalen Clownweltkrieg? Why is it a total war? Why is it totalen Clownweltkrieg? Why? Why is that? Because it's not content with dismantling your social order and your moral norms. It also wants to undermine the basis of truth and reality itself. And why is that? Well, if you're terminally confused and you're desperate for meaning, then anything the state supplies you at scale anything at all, if it supplies you with enough intensity and frequency, you're going to believe in that too. In short, demoralization, removing your moral and making you desperate for something to believe in, is an excellent way to govern people into the destruction of their entire way of life. And it's almost like that was the plan all along, if you look around and seek the monument of our liberating liberal democratic friends. I hope to have shown you today how the current thing, combined with social and technological processes, to partner with a project to destroy your entire way of life and to normalise insanity as a cardinal virtue of the most progressive and enlightened people in the world, which could be you, if only you are going to willingly become a stranger to reason and honk along with the diabolical carnival that is Total Clown World War. Where are the great novels about all this? Where are the great films about all this? Surely there should be some great literature written about this. You know, there's nothing there. There's nothing there, really. There's stuff on the fringes, I admit. But there's nothing there. All you get against Clown World War is mimetic counter-warfare. Now, in about 2015, 2016, you saw the appearance of Honkler, a happy little red-nosed, Pepe-based meme, who was immediately described as a dog whistle for Hitler. Why was that? Well, because, of course, Justin Trudeau had called the Canadian Freedom Convoy a bunch of Nazis for wanting to be free. Okay? They were protesting, of course, against the entirely justified lockdowns. Now, Honkler came out to satirise this and was immediately attacked as a far-right emblem. What Honkler really did was simply make lots of interesting memes about how mad everything was and how insane the official line was on practically everything, and how you would be punished if you didn't believe in it yourself, or even if you expressed some doubts about it. I mean, in 2015, another cartoon did appear called Murdoch Murdoch, but they never mentioned that one because it's astonishingly influential and really quite intelligent and also hilariously funny. I suggest you look it up. It's enjoying a little bit of a revival right now, and you might see that I bear a striking resemblance to one of the characters, which is entirely coincidental, I might add. So, look, all you've had in terms of response to Clown World War is countercultural and indeed subcultural mimetic counter-operations. But I'd like to point this out, even though this is just a bunch of people on their own making third-rate cartoons and putting together silly little images in Photoshop. We won the meme war. Like, we've won it. You know, these people and their terrible operations haven't won the day. They didn't get the biodigital dystopia. They didn't get everyone waving Ukraine flags. No one kneels for George Floyd anymore. The current things have all faded and collapsed. Just like all the wars that they've launched, they've actually lost. If you look again at that history of the 20th century, and how can you describe these wars as victories? I don't think I can think of one that would be seen as one in a dispassionate light. All their wars get lost. This should be encouraging to you. Clown World War II is also a disaster. Obviously it is. Its goal is to replace your entire way of life with a large-scale disaster, but remember, it's not just ridiculous and hilarious and satanic at the same time. Think of life as a battlefield on which Clown World War has been waged. And when you consider the battlefield after a war, it's usually littered with casualties. This one's no different. Clown World War, promoted by the elites of liberal democracy, is a mass casualty event, and I sincerely enjoin you to consider your life as that of a social missionary. If it hasn't broken you, if it hasn't driven you mad, if it hasn't turned you into a rage-fueled, poisoned individual mobilised by vengeance to declare war on everyone who isn't you or who doesn't share your delusions, if you're not mentally ill, if you're okay, if you have the time and the effort to spare, consider the needs of the wounded and the sick and minister to them where you can. Help the wounded. Help the sick. Look at these people not as your enemies, but as victims of an enormously sophisticated and ongoing operation to replace everything of value in their lives, including the value of their lives. Try and remember that the enemy is not victorious. Try and remember that there have been times when the victory of the enemy appeared to be inevitable. Those times are past now, and we can look back with a sort of detached fondness upon the extreme insanity of the many current things that made up the campaign of Clown World War. Goodbye to all that, and I'll see you next time on Frankly, where I'm going to talk to you about the customs of tribes. God bless you all. Remember, children of all ages, lifestyle changes are always possible if only you can tolerate the credit agreements.